In the far north of Canada lies a frozen wilderness, so beaten by the cold it has no trees, no shelter, and almost nothing to survive on. In 1819, a first-of-its-kind expedition led by Lieutenant John Franklin set out to cross it on foot, dragging their boats over ice and tundra to chart an unseen coast. But supplies soon ran out and brutal weather cut them off from rescue. 20 men were left to face one of the coldest regions on Earth. They would be driven to the unthinkable to survive. This is the story of Franklin's Overland Expedition. In 1819, Lieutenant John Franklin was a young officer in the Royal Navy. He was commissioned by the British Admiralty to help chart the northern coast of Canada. It was part of Britain's larger obsession with finding the Northwest Passage, a sea route that would link the Atlantic and Pacific across the top of the world. Now, you might have heard of Franklin's name before, and it is the same famous captain behind Franklin's expedition, which was famously lost in the Arctic for over 100 years, and if you want to hear about that, just check it out on the channel. But on this expedition, Franklin was a little bit less hardened and unprepared for the journey ahead of him. The team he brought with him was a mix of Royal Navy officers and Canadian voyageurs. They would haul 2 folding boats, a few sled dogs, and a limited stock of pemmican flour and tea across the Barrenlands. On this voyage, there was no insulated tents, no proper sleeping bags, and really no way to keep warm once the ground froze. These men were truly unfamiliar with the dangers of the Arctic. Now, Franklin's Overland Expedition would cover nearly 2,000 miles across the interior from Hudson Bay to the Arctic Ocean. The Admiralty had financed this journey, but Franklin's survival depended deeply on the fur trade companies that controlled the region. What supplies they had carried was never meant to last the whole journey. The plan was to resupply along the way from outpost to outpost in indigenous communities. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company controlled almost all the outposts in the area. They were ordered to guide and resupply Franklin as needed, but unfortunately, this was a fragile plan and one that would be hampered as the two companies became locked in a bitter rivalry. In order to cross the Barrenlands, Franklin does end up enlisting Dene guides under a chief named Akaicho. They warned him that ahead of them was a country that was almost lifeless because there was no trees for fire, little game to hunt, and storms that could close the trail for weeks. Franklin thanked him, made careful notes, and pressed north into the wilderness where no European had ever crossed. Every poorly planned step further into the wilderness brought the entire expedition further from rescue and closer to an impending disaster. The expedition ends up leaving York Factory on the coast of Hudson's Bay in 1819, dragging with them their almost 600-pound boats. The air was thick with mosquitoes, so dense that men choked on them as they tried to breathe. They crossed the edge of the taiga, the endless northern boreal forest, into a landscape the Dene called the Land of Little Sticks. Only stunted shrubs and lichen would grow here. The wind was so fierce it made every night at the camp a literal hell. The men would sleep in the open, wrapped in caribou skins, staring at the cold sky. Their fires would burn low, fueled by nothing more than scraps of twigs and wet moss. From the start, their supply lines began to falter. Promised caches of food were nowhere to be found, and any of the traders they met were late, distracted, or unwilling to risk a journey to help them out. At Fort Chipewyan, the supplies meant to restock them never materialized. The rival fur companies had failed to coordinate, leaving the outposts nearly empty. And as they pushed northwest, Franklin began to rely more and more on the Dene, whose hunters provided the group with fish and caribou to keep them alive. The first winter, from 1819 to 1820, was spent literally inching their way upriver through ice and floodwater, dragging boats across portages that seemed endless. By the time they reached Great Slave Lake in July of 1820, nearly a year and 1,000 miles after they started, Franklin's rations were running dangerously low. They had to begin dividing up each portion of pemmican into smaller and smaller pieces. But rationing would only go so far. Akaicho's hunters warned them that the land ahead offered nothing but silence. Franklin listened and made polite notes in his journal, but insisted that they keep going. He believed European perseverance would see them through. But unfortunately, that doesn't fill empty stomachs. And the first signs of trouble came quietly. Several men collapsed under their loads, too exhausted to stand, likely as a result of malnourishment. Others began to suffer frostbitten hands while dragging the boats over ice and half-frozen rivers. Franklin would note their suffering in their journal, saying that,
The men were much fatigued and footsore, their hands swollen and blistered by the continual immersion in water.
To him, these weren't disasters yet, just simple delays. By the spring of 1821, the worst of the winter's darkness had passed. The Arctic was beginning to come to life, and the sun stayed with the men longer and longer each day. The rivers broke free of ice, and the men got to see the tundra come alive. Franklin took this as a sign to push further on. Against every warning, he ordered the expedition to continue north. They were going to reach the Arctic Ocean one way or the other. And after nearly 2 years of marching, they were close to their goal. And at this point, he refused to return empty-handed. The expedition had reached the Coppermine River, and they would follow it north until they reached the ocean. It should have been a moment of triumph, but instead the sight that greeted them was desolation. A flat gray sea rimmed with ice stretching into the mist. The coastline was barren rock, swept by freezing wind, without a tree or a scrap of shelter in sight. Every day they would spend out there would literally be a fight, especially considering how low they were on supplies. The Dene hunters who had guided them to this point would turn back. This was as far as they had agreed to take the party, and they began their trip back to Fort Enterprise. Here they would prepare supplies and food for the expedition's return trip. Franklin and his men would now have to survive out here completely on their own. With the scarcity of food, they were able to hunt a few ptarmigan and hares they could and scrape some fish from the shallows. When the wind rose too strong for a fire, they would end up eating the fish raw. Every time they caught a fish or hunted a bird, it bought them a few more hours of strength. Franklin was determined to justify this expedition, and he kept pressing further and further west, determined to chart every inlet and headland that he could. But unfortunately, every mile of coastline was another mile where they burned extra supplies. The men did everything they could to row through the slush and sea ice, their fingers often raw and their bodies starved. By August, the Arctic summer was already fading. The men had mapped barely 200 miles of coastline, far less than the Admiralty had hoped. But the ice and exhaustion forced them to stop at a place Franklin would name Point Turn Again. This marked the end of their outward journey. Ahead of them lay nothing more but frozen sea, and unfortunately behind them was 1,000 miles of wilderness. The choice to retreat south became a race against time. All the men knew that the return journey home was going to be one of desperation. They were already beat up and starving, and they had barely any supplies left to last them. By early September 1821, Franklin's men were barely marching along. They were literally starving to death as they walked. Every day grew shorter and shorter, and each night colder. The first snows had already began to fall, turning the muskeg to ice and the rivers to slush. They followed the Coppermine River south, dragging their battered canoes through the freezing shallows. Then came the final blow. One of the boats was smashed in the rapids, swallowed by the current along with most of the remaining food, ammunition, and cooking gear. What little hope remained went downstream with it. The morale was broken after losing that gear, and from here on, their clothes were soaked, their fingers numb, and it was a fight to get every fire going. Hypothermia had set in for some, yet somehow Franklin still pushed them, believing they could reach Fort Enterprise, the outpost where Akaicho's people were waiting there with supplies. But unfortunately, some of the men were beginning to fall behind and were just simply too weak to travel anymore. Franklin knew that they couldn't all go on together. Franklin ordered the canoes abandoned, and he would divide the group. This was a hard choice, but a necessary one. He and the strongest would push ahead to Fort Enterprise, while Dr. Richardson and Lieutenant Hood would stay behind with the weakest men, trying to survive off the land until Franklin could return. George Back, another member of the group, was frostbitten and determined, and he volunteered to go ahead and travel light and fast, hoping to reach Fort Enterprise ahead of everyone, find Chief Akaicho, and send rescue, hopefully meeting Franklin's advance party on the trail. Back vanished into the snow, moving south alone. Franklin soon followed with the remaining men in what was called the advance party. They were burdened by some of the sick men who were still able to walk and the last of their gear. By this time, snow was beginning to fall regularly, and Franklin's party pushed inland towards Fort Enterprise starving, half blind from cold and hunger, their boots frozen to their feet, moving forward step by step, literally only out of the instinct to survive. I really want to say thanks for joining in this episode. If you like this kind of survival historic content, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you really want to help us out, share it with somebody you know. With that, I'll move on. The main party at the camp watched Franklin depart over the horizon from the rough shelter of stones and brush. Lieutenant Robert Hood and Dr. John Richardson, and a few of the voyagers who were barely still alive would remain here until they were rescued. The weakest men had been left there to rest, too frail to continue towards Fort Enterprise. They built a low fire pit from flat stones and stretched a tattered tarp across bent willows to block the wind. Every night, frost would creep in through the cracks. Their breath froze to the walls and then melted again with the morning fire. For days, they trapped what they could, which was nothing more than a few ptarmigan, hare, and even a fox. Their ration of flour was long gone, and each man lived on a few mouthfuls of boiled lichen scraped from the rocks. All they could do to stay warm was huddle together underneath some caribou, which were soaked from the constant freeze and thaw. Then the first men began to die. It was Pelche, Samandre, and Valiant. Whether it was hypothermia or illness, they could no longer go on. The men were too weak to bury them, so Richardson and the others simply dragged their bodies a short distance from camp and covered them with snow. Michael Terre Haute, one of the voyagers, soon began acting strangely. The isolation and malnourishment had seemed to be getting to him. He refused to gather wood or lichen and didn't partake in the camp's chores. He muttered to himself that there were no animals left and they might as well kill and eat each other. He would often volunteer, though, to go out hunting, and when he did, he would return with strips of meat and roast them over a low flame. He said it was hare or partridge, but no one saw the carcasses. The pieces seemed too large and the color too dark. The smell hung in the air, was sweet and metallic, and just something was off about it, but the men ate it anyway. Hood, who was too weak to move, was barely able to lift his pen anymore to write in his journal. But his last entries were short and broken, and written in a trembling hand, and then stopped on October 20th. He had begun to suspect that Michael Terre Haute was up to something nobody wanted to think about. That afternoon, Richardson and John Hepburn returned from gathering moss to find Hood dead. He died from a single gunshot wound to the head, and Michael Terre Haute was standing nearby, calm and expressionless. He was holding Hood's rifle and claimed that there had been an accident and Hood had shot himself in the head while cleaning his weapon. Neither man believed him, and the reality began to set in that all along, Terre Haute had been feeding them parts of the men that had died before. Michael's story changed each time he spoke, and he began to carry himself with an eerie calm. Over the next 2 days, his behavior grew erratic, and he began to mutter threats. It was October 23rd when Michael bent near the fire, and Richardson raised his pistol and shot him through the head. They could simply no longer live among the cannibal that had fed them their friends, or somebody so erratic that they had to constantly watch over their shoulders. After this point, the only two survivors of this party sat in silence. Richardson later wrote, "The whole scene was awful beyond description," and he was right. And unfortunately for these two men, even though they eliminated the threat that Terre Haute was, they still had to fight for their survival. Now elsewhere, Franklin's advance party was still crawling south towards Fort Enterprise, at this point living off of nothing but boiled bones and scraping soot from their kettles for calories. The entire expedition, it seems, had fallen into chaos. But yet, somehow, they pressed forward. I wonder if they had known that the small camp behind them had followed into Starvation and Madness, if they still would have kept moving, or if they would have turned back. But there was no way for them to know. All they could do was keep searching for rescue. During this time, too, now remember at this point, Lieutenant Back had actually went out ahead of everyone trying to reach rescue first, traveling lighter and faster, hoping he could find a kaicho or at least some supplies. He had nothing more than a single blanket and a gun. He set off alone in a final gamble for everyone's survival. For days and possibly weeks, he traveled through storms, sleeping in snowdrifts and drinking melted ice. Surviving on scraps of lichen and the occasional ptarmigan, he would later describe his journey as beyond the powers of human endurance. But somehow he kept going, driven by the thought that the lives of every man behind him depended on his next step. And not far behind Back was Franklin's advance party. Slower and burdened by a few weak men and what little gear they still carried, the snow at this point was knee-deep in spots and the wind unrelenting. They were starving, half-blind, and some of their hands were black with frostbite. Each morning, fewer men rose. Those who could still stand pulled the others forward until they collapsed too. Then one day, through the blowing snow, they saw a dark outline in a distance. It was a wooden shelter. They called it the Old House, and it was an abandoned trapper's hut. It was half collapsed and buried in the snow, but it could just mean their survival. Inside, they found a few frozen bones, a pile of ashes, and a length of broken fishing net. There was almost nothing that they could use. It wasn't salvation, but at least there was walls that would keep them out of the wind. For days, they huddled in here, too weak to go out and hunt, and they literally resorted to cutting strips off their moccasins, scraping soot from the chimney for grease, and boiling this concoction into a glue that they would eat. When one man died, the others simply dragged his body outside, again too weak to bury him. At times, they would also boil lichen that they could find, but it didn't take long that all their sources of their kind of makeshift food was all gone. Gathered what was left of his men and decided that they would push once more towards Fort Enterprise. They began walking until their legs gave out, and when they couldn't walk, they crawled. Faces scoured raw by ice, they moved in silence, the sound of the wind filling the spaces where the conversation used to be. And at last, on October 29th, they reached Fort Enterprise, the place that was supposed to save them. They forced the door open and found nothing but emptiness. There was cold rooms and bare shelves. There was no food anywhere and no warm fires to be found. They searched around, but Akaicho wasn't there, nor was George back. The supply convoy, it seems, never arrived, and here they found themselves still on the brink of starvation and death. Some of the men dropped where they stood in disbelief. Others sat in the corners motionless with their eyes open, but seeing nothing. Franklin himself was skeleton at this point and his teeth blackened, but still he found the strength to write notes by the candlelight, not knowing if he would be able to get his men out alive. And meanwhile, during this time, Dr. Richardson and John Hepburn, back at the main camp where the cannibalism occurred, they decided they had waited as long as they could endure. Enough time had passed without Franklin's return. They knew that they were probably on their own. They gathered what little remained, which was nothing more than a kettle and a musket, and they struck out south, trying to follow the faint path that the advance party had. For days they would trudge through the snow, eating lichen and pieces of burned caribou skin, guided by nothing but instinct and faith. Somehow, unbelievably, the two did reach Fort Enterprise, and here they found Franklin and his men barely alive, and were met with the same disbelief that there was no food to be found here, and almost no safety. The men resorted to tearing up floorboards for firewood, and scraped grease from old kettles and boiled scraps of leather, anything they could do just to get a few calories. There was no sign of George back, and days at Fort Enterprise turned into silence, and the men began to wonder if Back had perished or, even worse, had abandoned them. Franklin and Richardson wrote by candlelight day after day, their hands shaking, and at one point noting that death now seemed inevitable. And it was on one cold night when all of a sudden they heard faint voices rise above the wind. It was human voices calling in Dene. To the men's astonishment, George Back had arrived with a group of Dene hunters. It turns out, when he had found Fort Enterprise empty, he ended up going further south until he found Chief Akaicho and led him and his hunters back through the storm to rescue the men left behind. Out of 20 men who left that Arctic coast, only 11 were still alive. And it turns out the fort had been empty because the promised supply convoy never arrived. It was lost in the feud between the Hudson's Bay and the Northwest Companies. The men had reached safety's doorstep only to find it barren. But after all their bad luck, Chief Akaicho and the Dene hunters found them, thanks to Back. They nursed the survivors back to health and then brought them south, half dead, frostbitten, but alive. Franklin's party reached civilization the following spring. And back in England, Franklin was hailed as a hero. The press called him the man who ate his boots. These men, what they went through is absolutely incredible. The Arctic had stripped them down to nothing. But for Franklin, it wasn't enough. Now, dubbed Sir John Franklin, he would lead another expedition to this land, trying to find the Northwest Passage in a grand 1845 voyage, which is much better equipped, better planned, and yet doomed all the same. If you want to find out the fate of that expedition, check out the story in the channel, because, well, it's almost as worse, if not worse than this one. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be back again in 2 weeks. Thank you.